it doesn't ruin the film completely. The explanation that's provided in the exposition does at least make some sense. Tenet, however, is a different story. Nolan again clearly understands that inversion is something the audience will have to feel as they see it.
Don't try to understand it. Feel it.
And yet he's constantly insisting on explaining aspects of inversion to us throughout the whole film.
You mean reverse chronology? Like Feynman and Wheeler's notion of a positron as an electron, moving backwards in time.
In a parallel worlds theory, we can't know the relationship between consciousness and multiple realities.
These explanations could just be annoying and bothersome to the pacing or emotion of the film, like they are in Inception and Interstellar.
Is your head hurt yet?
Yes.
But at least for me, most of them just make inversion itself more confusing. All the explaining forces me to try to think about and understand what's going on in the film conceptually instead of just letting me feel it, which harms the film for me. But even this use of exposition to explain the concept I could forgive if things stopped there. I've criticized how noticeable the exposition is and how much it's used in all three films, but I still find Interstellar and Inception enjoyable to watch. However, there are two new ways that Nolan misuses exposition in Tenet that really harms the film. I connect with Inception and Interstellar because in spite of their exposition issues, they have emotionally grounded and motivated characters. In Inception, Cobb is trying to get back with his children and is struggling with his wife Mal. This emotional character motivation is established partly through Cobb telling the story of his past, but it's also something we get to see. Cobb's emotional motivation and conflict is something that's established through scenes where performance allows us to see the emotional stakes for the character. In Interstellar, Cooper's emotional motivation is also similarly grounded on screen.
Vas en primer lugar. Vas en primer lugar. Racha asesina.
emotional stakes of the film are clearly grounded in performance that we get to see. In Tenet, however, we get almost none of this. Instead, Nolan leans almost entirely on exposition for any kind of emotional character motivation or development.
He's a good kid.
He's everything.
This is embodied most clearly through what is the film's worst and most laughable line.
Everyone and everything that's ever lived, destroyed, instantly. Says enough.
Including my son.
Nolan clearly knows he needs to give his characters personal and emotional stakes, and this is his attempt to do so. But this time, instead of showing these stakes on screen, he just has the characters say them out loud.
He's everything.
This is also how Sator's motivations are handled. He supposedly wants to end his life and take the whole world with him.
No, you've missed the point. He's intending to end his life.
But we don't get to see why he feels this way. We're just told about it.
And he's taking the world with him.
If he can't happen, no one can.
This also applies to the protagonist. He goes to extreme lengths just to help Kat,
I'm taking her through. I'm not gonna let her die. I'll take my chances.
but we never see anything to justify why he cares enough about her to risk his life and the mission for her, especially when he's already expressed that he's willing to make compromises for a mission.
Would you take a child hostage? A woman?
If I had to.
His friendship with Neil is ripe for emotional motivation or stakes, but it goes completely unutilized besides just being a clever twist.
I think it's the end of a beautiful friendship.
But for me, it's just the beginning.
We get up to some stuff. You're gonna love it. You'll see.
I've been criticizing the film nonstop, so let me pause and highlight what I think is one of the few genuine moments of visual character development. At the beginning of the film, we get the setup about Kat seeing another woman dive off the yacht.
Never felt such envy
You don't seem each other's type.
of her freedom.
Fast forward to the end of the film, where future Kat is on the boat in the past. Here, Nolan lets us watch and see Kat make the decision to linger for a few minutes before she dives, choosing to let her past self see her future self, intentionally planting the seed of envy, and we realize, without need for an explanation, that Kat was the woman who dived off the boat. It's a great moment, and a big part of why it's so great is that we can understand and feel this climax in Kat's character arc and the emotion and weight of the decision she's making without being told. In Inception and Interstellar, there are many moments like this where a major plot element is revealed visually so that we get to recognize the character and plot developments for ourselves instead of just being told about them. In Tenet, however, besides the example I just showed you and maybe a few others, most of the major plot developments are revealed in exposition. For example, take the very significant reveal that the protagonist has been working for himself the whole time.
I realized I wasn't working for you. We've both been working for me.
There's no visual clue for this, we don't see why he's realized this, we don't see any kind of emotional impact that this realization has had on him. He just tells us that he realized it. It makes the plot revelations way less satisfying and impactful, and finally, it just adds an absurd amount of sheer volume to the exposition in the film. Nolan is already using exposition to explain the concept and the rules of inversion, and he's also using exposition to establish the character's motivations and emotional stakes of the film. And when, in addition to all that, he uses exposition to explain the film's convoluted plot, instead of showing us the revelations and details, it all just mushes together into an exhausting onslaught of exposition that is periodically interrupted by some of the most inventive action scenes I've seen in a movie in a long time. What's most frustrating is that we know Nolan is capable of good visual storytelling. In Dunkirk, there's almost no dialogue and he relies on it almost entirely. But in Tenet, I think he relies on it way too much, and for me personally, it ran what would otherwise be a great movie into the ground. Thanks to Audible for sponsoring this video. Earlier in the video, I talk about the Pope in the Pool method of exposition, and you can learn about that method in Blake Snyder's Save the Cat. You could get this audiobook for
Queda un minuto.
To meet a friend.
Become known for his massive, visually spectacular films. He comes across as a...
Quedan 30 segundos.
Thanks to Mubi for sponsoring this video. Christopher Nolan has become known for his massive, visually spectacular films. He comes across as a highly technical filmmaker, uses expensive and complicated IMAX and 70mm film cameras to achieve the best possible image quality, uses incredibly technically challenging practical effects to tell epic stories that span dimensions of time and space, consciousness, and vast conflicts. So it might seem like a little story about a few burglars shot on black and white 16mm film, comprising mostly of handheld footage, might not have much in common with Nolan's later blockbuster efforts. But let's take a closer look at how Nolan has been technically challenging himself from the very beginning, and how ideas and techniques that he learned and used in his first film are still present in his filmmaking today.
You check this out.
Uh-huh.
You watch him go to work, you saw his routine. Yeah. What's his job?
He works in a bank.
This guy's unemployed.
One of the defining characteristics of Nolan's work seems to be a desire to challenge himself technically. Whether it's the amazing effort he put into filming the dogfight sequences in Dunkirk with actual planes, or the crazy practical effects he used in Inception, Interstellar, and his Batman films, the easy way and Christopher Nolan don't often mix. It's not obvious just from watching the movie, but if you learn more about the story of how Following was made, you can see how this tendency to push himself and his crew technically started with Following.
You'd figure out how to do something that looked pretty good very quickly. And that was very much the production methodology we transferred over to the film we were making.
Following was a technical challenge, just a different kind.
Capturar la bandera. Bandera recogida. Bandera perdida. Bandera recogida. Bandera perdida. Bandera recogida. Bandera capturada. Vas en primer lugar.
Matanza de piloto.
Bandera recogida. Bandera perdida. 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 Doble muerte. Racha asesina. Bandera recogida. Bandera perdida. Bandera recogida. Bandera perdida. Bandera capturada. Bandera recogida. Bandera perdida. Bandera recolocada. Bandera recogida. Bandera perdida. Bandera recogida. Venganza. Bandera perdida. Bandera recogida. Bandera capturada. Fin del juego.
From the ones that Nolan faces now.
I think what following represents is kind of the peak of what I was able to do on my own or just with friends, just using our own resources and borrowing equipment and sort of using the things around us to make a film.
Following was shot as a no-budget film, and almost everything about it was crafted to make the film work in spite of the budgetary and technical limitations of the movie. In the director's commentary and interviews when talking about the film, Nolan focuses on these technical decisions, and it's obvious that to him this was the most interesting aspect of creating the movie. Unable to secure permits to film in public, the street locations were shot guerrilla style with a shaky handheld look. The film was shot in black and white to avoid having to match the color temperature of the cheap lights they had available to the temperature of the natural light they often relied on. The story involves a character that is a loner because actors and extras are expensive and difficult to secure. The non-linear structure was used because it made it easier to edit around bits of scenes that were missing or didn't work out. And characters often stand by windows because the light coming through them was often all Nolan had to work with. Some of these techniques Nolan would carry with him throughout his career or imitate with large sets and equipment even long after it would be necessary. While the nature of the technical challenges Nolan is facing are different now, from the very beginning those challenges and discovering unique ways to overcome them were obviously very compelling to him as a filmmaker.
I think that getting a strong technical grounding was very important for me, and learning how to photograph things on film, expose the film correctly, choose the film stocks, those kind of things, has served me extremely well as I've gone on to bigger and bigger films.
Christopher Nolan's obsession with time and nonlinear storytelling has been dissected in detail by many other essayists. so I won't linger here long, but I can't completely gloss over probably the most obvious connection between Following and Nolan's later work. Following uses 3 converging storylines, showing us pieces of all 3 at the beginning, and then slowly unraveling them, revealing information to the audience bit by bit. Both time itself and a story's timeline are things that Nolan is obviously fascinated by. He uses non-linear storytelling most explicitly in Memento.
So we cut between the two the whole way through. So we alternate.
Asesino. Perdiste el primer lugar. Empatado en primer lugar. Vas en primer lugar. Vas en primer lugar. Vas en primer lugar. Racha asesina. Matanza de francotirador. Doble muerte. Fin del juego.
scene here, scene there, scene there, scene there, scene there, scene there, and they meet towards the end of the film.
And extensively in The Prestige and his most recent film Dunkirk, but he's used non-linear narrative to some extent in almost all of his films. And time as a theme played a heavy role in both Inception and Interstellar. At the beginning of Following, we get a scene where exposition happens through a conversation.
That's when I started shadowing.
Shadowing.
Shadowing, following. I started to follow people.
Who?
Anyone first.
While on screen, we see images that help us understand that exposition.
Every magic trick consists of 3 parts, or acts.
This is a technique that Nolan will return to throughout his filmography.
A 58-year-old semi-retired accountant. He and his wife had been in this car accident. Nothing too serious, but he's acting funny. He can't get a handle on what's going on. The doctors find some possible damage to the hippocampus. Nothing conclusive. But Sammy can't remember anything for more than a couple of minutes.
When we wound up on the shore of our own subconscious, we lost sight of what was real. We built a world for ourselves. We did that for years. We built our own world.
The wheat had died. The blight came and we had to burn it. And we still had corn. We had acres of corn. But mostly we had dust.
The legend is that there was a mercenary who worked for a local warlord. He fell in love with the warlord's daughter. They were married in secret. When the warlord found out, the mercenary was condemned to this pit.
Listen to this. And listen to this. And this. If Nolan's movies have a sound, this is it. And it's been there in some form from the very beginning. Finally, I want to touch on a reoccurring character trait in Nolan's films. In Following, we're presented with burglars who are more interested in the philosophical implications of their actions than the average burglar might be.
It's like a dog. They hide. But actually, it's see what's right. It's this way, it looks like the same coin. This way, the nurse can see it. That's what it's all about.
Later, we'll see this character trait repeat.
I'm using this monster.
Point is that a real magician tries to invent something new that other magicians want to scratch their heads over, you know?
I'm a good cop, man. But there's always something that they can use. In order to get at your credibility, you know that.
Don't talk like one of them. You're not.
You asked me for something that you hope you understand the gravity of that. The seed that we plant in this man's mind will grow into an idea. This idea will define him. It may come to change. It may come to change everything about it.
Whether the character is a magician, a superhero, someone who grants dreams, and anything else, or an astronaut, the philosophical implications of the character's actions are always very interesting to those characters. These are the surface connections between Following and the rest of Nolan's work that I can show you, but I think a majority of its influence on his career exists below the surface. Nolan never went to film school, and creating Following was a formative experience for him as a filmmaker. I think he continues to carry many of the lessons he learned working on that film forward into his filmography. And examining the film and how he made it sheds light on the things that motivate his approach to writing and directing. Movie featured Nolan's Following a couple months ago, and if you're interested in my Directors Before series, Mubi will be right up your alley. Mubi is a movie streaming and download service. The best part about it is their excellent curation. There's only 30 films available at a time. Every day one gets added and one gets taken away. Each one is chosen and recommended by a human. One of my favorite parts of the service are the little blurbs they write explaining each film's significance and why you should be interested in it. Mubi is available globally, and there are never any ads. Try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/ThomasWhite. That's mubi.com/ThomasWhite for your extended free trial. This was the second part of my directors before series. I'm going to continue putting out videos for this series, but since they involve examining a director's entire filmography, they take a little longer to make. So subscribe and keep your eyes peeled for the next episode, and check out the videos I'll put out in the meantime.
Asesina. Frenesí asesino.
Fin del juego.
If you wanted to meet a friend at any possible location on Earth, you would need to give them a precise longitude, latitude, and altitude. Would this be enough information for two people to meet? Well, if you showed up at that location, there's no guarantee that you would meet your friend. Why? Because you did not give them one more crucial piece of information, the time. He or she would have to know what time they were to meet you at that precise location. There are 4 dimensions of the universe, 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension. With these 4 coordinates, you could rendezvous anywhere in the universe. In fact, these 4 dimensions can describe any event in the universe. But how did time become a dimension? It seems like an odd thing because time is not measured in meters or inches like the other spatial dimensions. It's measured in minutes and seconds. It doesn't seem to fit with the other 3, yet it appears to be a fundamental component of the universe in which we live, as fundamental as the other spatial dimensions. In fact, time is an inseparable component of space. That's why physicists refer to the geometry of the universe not as space, but as space-time. How did the idea of time as a dimension come about? How can we best visualize these 4 dimensions? And what really happens when space and time start doing seemingly weird things when 2 objects move relative to each other? That's coming up right now. In the late 1800s, scientists had recognized that there was an inconsistency between 2 theories: Newton's laws of motion and Maxwell's equations describing electricity and magnetism. The problem was the speed of light. Maxwell had shown that light was a propagating wave, a disturbance in the electromagnetic field, a changing electric field continually giving rise to a changing magnetic field, which in turn gives rise to a changing electric field again, leading to a self-propagating electromagnetic wave. And this theory predicted what the speed of this wave is. So it predicted the speed of light, which is about 300,000 kilometers per second, or 300 million meters per second. The question was, what would be the measured speed of light if the person measuring it was moving? For example, a person moving with the spin of the Earth. What would the speed of light be then? According to Newton, this moving observer should measure a different speed than someone who was not moving. The measured speed should be the speed of the person plus the speed of light. But Maxwell's equations seem to indicate that light has just one speed, c. There was no accounting for a speed of light that was any different than what the equations predicted. Almost every scientist at the time, including Maxwell himself, presumed that Newton was correct and that Maxwell's equations were incomplete and needed to be modified. In 1887, 2 American scientists by the name of Michelson and Morley devised a highly sensitive experiment that could measure the speed of light in the direction of motion of the Earth. So the expectation was that the speed would be measured to be c plus the speed of rotation of the Earth. What they found shocked scientists of the time.
Asesino. Vas en primer lugar.
If you wanted to meet a friend at any possible location on Earth, you would need it to be modified. In 1887, two American scientists by the name of 100,000 kilometers per second, or 300 million meters per second. The question was, what would be the measured speed of light if the person measuring it was moving? For example, a person moving with the spin of the Earth. What would the speed of light be then? According to Newton, this moving observer should measure a different speed than someone who was not moving. The measured speed should be the speed of the person plus the speed of light. But Maxwell's equations seem to indicate that light has just one speed, c. There was no accounting for a speed of light that was any different than what the equations predicted. Almost every scientist at the time, including Maxwell himself, presumed that Newton was correct and that Maxwell's equations were incomplete and needed to be modified. In 1887, two American scientists by the name of Michelson and Morley devised a highly sensitive experiment that could measure the speed of light in the direction of motion of the Earth. So the expectation was that the speed would be measured to be c plus the speed of rotation of the Earth. What they found shocked scientists of the time because it was totally unexpected. They found that the speed of light does not vary one iota due to the motion of the Earth. This is one of the most consequential experiments of the last 200 years. A resolution of this unexpected result remained a mystery for over a decade. Henri Poincaré came close to solving it, but it was not until Albert Einstein came along and proposed a pretty radical idea at the time that we got a full resolution. Einstein suggested that it was not Maxwell's equations that needed to be changed, but Newton's near sacred laws of motion. He determined that the speed of light does not change in any reference frame and worked out the crazy implications of this idea. Einstein showed that observers moving at different speeds will disagree about the distance and time between two events. In other words, they will experience space and time differently. This is the meaning of the relative in relativity theory. It means that measurements of space and time are relative to the person measuring them. But the key to understanding this theory is that some things don't change, namely the laws of physics and the speed of light remain the same for everyone. There is one very important idea that came out of Einstein's theory that Einstein himself did not come up with. It came from German mathematician Hermann Minkowski, who was Einstein's former professor. He was astonished by his former student's theory and thought about it deeply and realized that relativity is really a theory about the geometrical relationship between space and time. He famously said in 1908, henceforth, space by itself and time by itself are doomed to fade away into mere shadows, and only a kind of union of the two will preserve an independent reality. This union between space and time is what he called space-time. So we say there are 4 dimensions to specify an event in the universe. 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. The problem is, how the heck do you visualize these 4 dimensions? That's not easy for our 3-dimensional brains to do. So to make it a little more visually intuitive, we simplify it to 3 dimensions. 2 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension. So we eliminate one of the spatial dimensions for simplicity. So what we get is a 3D looking graph called a space-time diagram, where time is depicted in the vertical axis and the 2 dimensions of space are depicted in the horizontal axis. The only problem is that time has completely different units than space. So how do we put it in one diagram in a way that is consistent with the other coordinates? Minkowski suggested that we can depict time as a length. How do we do this? We simply multiply time by the speed of light. If the speed of light is 300 million meters per second, then we can say that 300 millionths of a second is 1 meter. It's just the amount of time that it takes for light to travel 1 meter. So the time dimension can be expressed in terms of the speed of light times time, or ct. So the vertical axis is labeled ct, which is a length. We can now have 3 consistent coordinates. Let's look at how something would be depicted on this graph. A non-moving particle would be depicted as a vertical line because it would not be moving in any of the spatial dimensions, but it would be moving forward in time. Minkowski called this a world line.
Quedan 5 minutos.
A uniformly moving point would be depicted as a diagonal line on this graph, because it would be moving in at least one of the spatial coordinates as it's moving forward in time. An accelerating particle would be a curved one. Now, what would happen if we flashed a light somewhere in this 2D space? Let's call this event A. The light would spread in all directions with time. This forms the shape of a cone. So Minkowski called this a light cone. Now, if a person was standing still and observing the light, there would be a point on this cone where his world line would intersect with the light cone. That would be an event, which we can call event B. So the light cone really represents all the future events in space-time that the light reaches from its initial event A. Similarly, a light cone can be built for any event A in space-time to show all other future events that are reached by event A. In diagrams like this, you'll sometimes see an upside-down cone. This is the past light cone and represents all the past events in space-time that reach event A. Event A can be you here and now. If you were in space at any moment in time, then all the starlight reaching from all directions would be the past light cone of events reaching you at a particular moment of time, the here and now. And the further out you look, the further back in time you would be looking as well. The points outside these two light cones are causally disconnected from event A, meaning they cannot reach or be reached by event A. Through the idea of events, world lines, and light cones, Minkowski proposed that Einstein's relativity is really about geometry, the geometry of space-time. And believe it or not, Einstein himself was not keen on this idea initially. He came around later and realized his old professor was indeed on the right track. At this point, you might be asking, okay, this is fine, I kind of get it, but how does relativity enter into the picture? How is the idea of different observers in different reference frames moving at different speeds affect this cone? So let's look again at our light cone and see what happens when the light is not moving from the perspective of a static observer. If I place two light detectors an equal distance apart from the source of the light, then these detectors will detect the light simultaneously. This is true as long as the objects are not moving. The world lines of the two detectors and the light source are perfectly vertical because they're not moving. However, if the objects are moving from the perspective of the static observer, and we perform the same experiment, then the detection events are no longer simultaneous. This is because the light reaches the two detectors at different times. One detector is moving towards the light, so it detects the light first. The second detector is moving away from the light, so it detects the light later. Note that the light cone remains the same because the speed of light does not change. However, the world lines of these three objects change from the perspective of the static observer. They are tilted towards the direction of movement. Since one detector is moving closer to the light, its detection event will be lower on its world line than the detector that is moving away from the light. So its detection event will be higher on its world line. Now here's the crucial part. What I've shown you is from the perspective of an observer, observer A, who is looking at this from a distance and not moving in any of the reference frames. However, from the perspective of the objects, things are quite different. In other words, if there was an observer B attached to the objects such that he was not moving with respect to the objects in any of the reference frames, he would see simultaneous detection by the two light detectors, even though he's moving with respect to the first observer, observer A. From observer B's perspective, he and the objects are static, and it's observer A that's moving to the left. So the light cone and the world lines that observer B experiences will be straight up, identical to the ones seen by observer A when he was not moving with respect to the objects. That is, he sees simultaneous detection. Observer A, however, sees the tilted world lines and no simultaneity. So here's this seeming paradox. How can observer A and observer B experience the same event in the same space-time, but have two completely different conclusions? That is, how is it that observer A sees no simultaneity, but observer B sees simultaneity? Who is right? Well, they're both right. If observer A is a physicist, he'll explain that from his perspective, observer
Fin
B's
del
light
juego.
cone was tilted, such that he experienced simultaneity. Observer B, on the other hand, also being a physicist, will say that the reason observer A did not see simultaneity is because his light cone was tilted, such that the two detection events happened at different times. Neither is incorrect. So what this shows is that simultaneity is relative. It is relative to the observer. There is no absolute simultaneity in the universe. But each observer sees and experiences exactly the same space-time. The events are the same. So things can be relative, but they're all part of one space-time. These observers divide space and time in different ways depending on their frame of reference. But ultimately, it is one universe. And although simultaneity is relative, they will both agree on causality. Causality is preserved. I'll have details on why that's the case in an upcoming video. For now, I wanted to give you an overview of what light cones and world lines are all about, so you can refer to this video to get an understanding of the basics. In a future video, I'll show you what happens when these light cones are in extreme conditions, such as an infinite speed of light, inside a black hole, through a wormhole, and how one could build a time-traveling machine. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, if you want to study this topic in greater detail, there's a wonderful course on Brilliant, today's sponsor, called Gravitational Physics. It consists of 29 interactive lessons that walk you all the way from some of the basic fundamentals such as Newton's law of universal gravitation to more advanced concepts in gravity such as fields and energy balance. Along the way, you'll take quizzes and solve problems which
Asesino. Perdiste el primer lugar. Empatado en primer lugar. Vas en primer lugar. Venganza. marcha, asesino.
Fin del juego.
Asesino.
Vas en primer lugar. Fin del juego.